Good evening, and thank you all for your patience. My name is Charles Duggan. I'm the Heritage Officer here in Dublin City Council. We are really grateful for you all joining us here this evening for our lecture by Dr. Aoife Bhreatnach. Tonight's talk, Manuals of Immorality, has been organised to mark the centenary of the report of the Committee on Evil Literature and explores how Ireland's vast and long-lived censorship regime sought to control sexuality, reproduction and public morality by banning over 12,000 publications, profoundly shaping 20th century Irish society and human relationships. This lecture is the second in our 2026 series, so please take note on the screen of our upcoming talks and scan the QR code. And just to point out that if you, that our talk in June will take place in 12 Henrietta Street rather than here in the Quay venue. And I would book that because it'll be at least a beautiful setting to hear about what some Georgians got up to in the 18th century. If you have missed any of our talks, if you go onto our YouTube channel, which is Dublin City Heritage, you will be able to look back at talks that we have going back for quite a number of years on various different subjects to do with the built and cultural and social history of the city. With this lecture series, our aim is really to amplify different voices, to share fresh perspectives on familiar stories, and to shed light on those that are less well known. We also seek to showcase new and innovative research that deepens our understanding of Dublin's architectural, cultural and social history. The series is an initiative of the Dublin City Strategic Heritage Plan and is made possible through grant funding from the Heritage Council. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague Abigail O'Reilly, Graduate Heritage Officer, for her help in organising the series. I'd also like to express my gratitude to Cormac Leonard and Oriel McCabe, who are providing Irish Sign Language services for us here this evening, ensuring that the series is accessible to everybody. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Aoife Bhreatnach. Aoife is a researcher, writer and podcaster. I had the great pleasure of listening to her podcast series, Censored, during COVID. It was a wonderful and quite often very funny, but very insightful and richly detailed. So if you haven't encountered it, I would encourage you to do so. She writes, I've just jumped ahead of myself. She writes and presents Censored, which explores the censorship culture of 20th century Ireland. In each episode, Aoife tells the story of a book that was banned in Ireland, reading out the rude bits and rating the filth through censorship bingo, which is always guaranteed a laugh. The podcast, with over 90,000 downloads, was one of the Dublin Book Festival's literary podcasts we love right now in 2021. In seasons 10 and 11, Aoife was joined by Dr. Lloyd Houston to watch and review some of the filthy films banned in Ireland. She has written about censorship for the Irish Examiner and the Irish Times, while her historical writing includes 13 articles and a book, Becoming Conspicuous, Irish Travellers' Society and the State. Her creative writing appears in Howl, The Stinging Fly, and in the Radio na Gaeltachta Ashdí on Air. And in 2025, she was the recipient of the Hubert Butler Essay Prize, and she is currently writing a book on living in a censored Ireland. So would you please join me in welcoming Aoife to the podium?
Thanks, Charles. So I'll try not to go over time. If I do, I deeply apologise. I'm also going to try and speak very slowly because I have a habit of taking off like a train. So if I'm speaking too fast, somebody wave at me, please. So 100 years ago, the Committee on Evil Literature was at the start of its investigation into the proliferation of obscenity in the Irish Free State. Its report led directly to the Censorship of Publications Act, which was actively enforced from 1929 until the late 1990s. Censorship was an ever-present, often invisible part of life in Ireland. South African author J.M. Coetzee, a victim of his own country's censorship laws, observed that the most successful censors strive to become invisible. When no one notices censorship, it means everyone has internalized the censor's mentality and everyone works together to restrict speech, film, or publication. I'm fascinated by censorship because when I grew up in 1980s and 90s Ireland, I had no memories of it as a talking point. We endlessly debated abortion, divorce, and contraception. If you were there, you know. But I don't remember discussions of censorship as related to those issues. Yet Madonna's book Sex was banned in 1992. We didn't really even talk about that very much. It wasn't very controversial. Occasionally, a British newspaper or a magazine would be stopped at the border, sometimes just for one edition, sometimes because they had been banned. And then there were the long-term effects of decades-long censorship. Library stock was directly affected by bans that had been passed before 1967. Even when a book was released from censorship jail, it was impossible to buy because it was out of stock. For ordinary library readers like me in the 90s, the books on offer, therefore, were directly affected by the censors' decisions. Censorship was therefore invisible, but also all around us. And I want to talk today about how that happened. How did the official blacklist grow to more than 12,000 publications? Who helped to enforce censorship laws? And of course, the biggest question, what on earth were the censors afraid of? So firstly, I'd like to talk about what the problem was, according to the report of the Committee on Evil Literature, which was submitted to the government in 1926. This is a direct quote from about page 12. An innocent-looking advertisement of pills to prevent fat, when replied to by a young girl, led to the receipt of a parcel of immoral advertisements. It's an absolutely awful sentence, so wordy and terrible, but we can analyse it. There is a deep panic that this sentence contains, and the whole report is suffused by, about information, specifically information about sex, reproduction, and venereal disease. The use of a young girl as a victim here is typical of the arguments in favour of censorship. The ad looks innocent, but the girl is actually innocent until she's corrupted by those immoral advertisements that have been hidden behind the other ad. The great thing about the ads they're talking about is that they could be about anything. They don't actually say what immoral advertisements are. It could be about contraception. It could be actual dirty pictures. The committee just doesn't tell us. So like the smut merchants they hate, the committee knows that the human imagination is much better and more salacious than anything they could say out loud. There's a thrill to be had in imagining the horror. I think the committee members read a lot of Gothic novels. In spite of its name, though, the Committee on Evil Literature was, funnily enough, not particularly bothered by literature. It was newspapers and periodical magazines that they talk about in their report, because after all, novels don't generally contain advertisements for diet pills. However, the committee knew that there were many statutes that could be used to suppress the very thing they're worried about, the publication and circulation of dodgy ads. Free speech and publication was already restricted by law, inherited from the British state. And these are the most important laws that they're able to use if they want. As you can see, they date from 1857 all the way through to 1908. And on this slide, I've given you the name, the date, and then the bodies that are given the power under the legislation. So you can see the Gardaí, the Revenue, and the Postal Service have the power to stop dodgy ads, if you want to talk about just one thing. So these 5 statutes give powers to seize material, to detain people who circulate it, and to prosecute people for circulating illicit or immoral text and speech. They grant powers to both the police, the revenue, and the post office. Publications that move through the postal system could be stopped either by customs or the post office itself. By the time material reached the streets, the Gardaí had considerable power to prosecute. But they hardly ever used these powers. The Garda Commissioner told the committee they had used these laws just 3 times since the state was founded in 1922. And he's writing in 1926. So 3 times in 4 years, hardly an epidemic. In one case, a Mr. F from Dublin City was sent to prison for 12 months after a prosecution under the first of these here, the Obscenity Act. When his house was searched, the Gardaí discovered drawers full of rude postcards. The guards claimed they had learned about him from an ad in a British publication. Mr. F probably had a decent mail order business. Potential customers would write to him, request a catalogue, which he would send out. After he received the orders and cash through the post, he would post pornographic postcards to his customers. His downfall, unfortunately, was that he also sold face-to-face. It was when a detective purchased material from him in his house that he was caught. He received quite a harsh punishment. 12 months is a lot to receive. Mr. F had not committed theft or violence, but he still ended up in the Central Criminal Court suffering exemplary punishment. In a small city where everyone knows everyone's business, people would have noticed what happened when someone was caught distributing indecent material. Now, I think the effort expended in catching this one man is also interesting. How did the Gardaí know about Mr. F? I don't think there was a team of guards combing through the newspaper and magazine ads looking for Irish porn merchants. They probably received a tip-off from either the post office or customs officers who had stopped letters or parcels. Or maybe someone, maybe one of his neighbours, noticed what Mr. F was trading and informed on him. It takes a lot of people to enforce a law, and there were enough people who disapproved of indecent publications to make it possible. And by the way, all of these 3 indecency convictions that the guards mentioned in the report, all of them happened in Dublin City. The indecency problem in Ireland seems to have been strictly confined to dirty old Dublin, which as a Cork person, I'm jealous. So the Gardaí were just one of what we would call stakeholders today that contributed to the Committee on Evil Literature and that wrote about what was happening currently. The guards and everyone else agreed that there was a problem, and everyone supported the idea of legislation. But the publications everyone thought were smutty were newspapers and magazines rather than novels. And since Mr. F carried on his trade in dirty pictures through the small ads, that was clearly where the problem was greatest. Because the committee had recommended new legislation and because there was so much support for that, the government then did draft this new censorship law. So this is the main points out of the Censorship of Publications Act in 1929. It covers any publications. So it also covers images and prints, which aren't strictly written, but because they're published. So it's all about paper. And these are the 3 headings under which they're trying to catch immorality. Suggestive of or inciting to sexual immorality. So I would interpret that as pre- or extramarital sex. Unnatural vice, which is often a code for anything to do with queer sexuality, and the unnatural prevention of conception, so birth control and abortion. And these are the 3 headings which are enforced until the 90s. So this is the first tranche of banned material. As you can see from the date, these are all banned at one meeting. These are the first 13 banned books on the register, and I've highlighted in yellow the only fiction works here. So you can see out of 13, we have 3 fiction works. Everything else is about birth control in one form or another. These are forever bans, by the way. There's no appeals process until 1946. And the column language, which just has one entry, number 5, AEV. AEV stands for any English version. The Act applied to works in English only. Irish language works could never be banned by the Censorship Board. And you could read all the scandalous French literature you liked if you could read it in French. So, these are the first 13 banned periodicals. You'll see that in this case I've highlighted something called the New Leader. It was the newspaper of the British Labour Party, so kind of hardly really terribly dodgy. It's entered twice here, and that's because periodicals got a short-term ban, a 3-month ban, a month ban, until maybe sometimes they're banned permanently. Short-term bans can be appealed by publishers. These short bans are used by the board to discipline London-based publishers who would come to Dublin to meet with newsagents and civil servants, to discuss the content they published, and sometimes they made promises not to annoy the censors in the future. It's kind of odd that a law supposed to control newspapers was actually more lenient to newspapers than books. Newspaper editors are given a chance to change their ways, reform, while the books are just banned outright and forever. And of the 13 publications listed here, most were created by British publishers with an eye to the working class reader. Some were obviously left-wing, like New Leader, but others are just mass-market commercial publications. And I want to talk about a few of these periodical publications that are listed here in the first 13. Red Star Weekly. When I saw Red Star Weekly, I thought it must be some communist journal, no? Sadly, not. It's a magazine of stories, advice columns, and ads aimed at women. These sorts of commercial women's magazines had infuriated the Committee on Evil Literature, who classed them as either extremely undesirable or of, very damning, a milksop character. I'm not really sure what that means. So magazines like Red Star Weekly actually contained a lot of fiction. I think it's fair to see these bans as targeting fiction by and for women. We've forgotten about these kinds of magazines because, of course, they don't exist anymore, and how important they once were for fiction readers. The censorship regime is well known for banning literary fiction, but its suppression of this type of light entertainment is less understood. And for entertainment, this is the News of the World, now extinct. It's another title in that first 13 banned periodicals. So it's first banned briefly in May 1930, but by November 1930, it's banned forever and for good. I think how significant this ban is doesn't really get a lot of, attention in the popular mind. The News of the World was the biggest newspaper in Ireland that year, in 1930. It sold more than 130,000 copies per week. This is more than all of the Irish morning newspapers combined, okay? So you add up the Independent, the Times, and the big morning regionals like the Cork Examiner, and the News of the World sold more than all of those put together. And this could be the real dirty truth about post-independence Ireland. Everyone's reading the News of the World. And this is in spite of a long and loud campaign by Catholic religious groups against it. The News of the World was notorious for its court reports. It reported in often lurid detail on divorce, sex crime, and murder. It was a huge commercial success for that reason. Another reason, of course, was the sports results. Football and racing. It was very useful if you were, having a flutter. When the board banned this very popular newspaper in 1930, what do you think happened? Nothing. No one objected. No one complained. No one tried to defend reading the News of the World. From one week to the next, it went from the most widely read newspaper to invisible, but no one said anything. This silent acquiescence, I think, says a lot about public support for censorship. It's partly, of course, because it's mortifying to admit that you enjoy to read something like the News of the World. Who's going to stand up in public and say, actually, I love reading this? For us today, of course, in retrospect, it's embarrassing that nobody said anything. There were no marches, no strikes, no boycotts, no letter campaigns, just acceptance. The News of the World stayed illegal in Ireland until a variation order was added to the register in 1961. And this allowed an Irish edition to be sold here. You've probably noticed that British tabloids are sold as Irish editions. The Star, the Sun, the Mail, all branded Irish in small letters above the masthead. And this decision comes from the censorship regime. The Irish editions of these tabloids in the past could not contain ads for Mary Stopes clinics or any form of reproductive service that was available in Britain but not here. It's interesting, of course, that what wasn't deleted from the tabloids was page 3 and the busty young ladies. Because in the end, it mattered a lot more to the Irish censors to keep us ignorant on birth control information than nudie photographs. So you can see that the first obsession of the censorship board was to suppress reproductive information. But very quickly, they turned to fiction. And 79 of the first 100 bans issued were for novels. Where are we? Are we missing one? Right, sorry, mixed up. Some book bans you'll have heard about. They're fixtures in the popular memory. So there is one by, of course, there's Brendan Behan's Borstal Boy. I'm sure you all remember that, it's quite famous. There's Edna O'Brien's The Country Girls, and John McGahern's The Dark. And these are the most famous bans. There were thousands of others as the board issued prohibition orders week after week, year after year. And this slide shows some of the banned books I've read for the podcast. Almost every genre of fiction appeared on the blacklist. There's serious literature, there's memoir, detective stories, thrillers, romance, historical fiction. The only genre I couldn't find was the Western. This genre was incredibly widely read through to the 60s, but never seems to have been banned. There we are. So you're probably thinking that a blacklist would be a great guide for readers looking to find filth. And it would have been if people could consult it. The blacklist itself was in these bound volumes, kept in the censor's office, and if you were in Dublin, you could view it during civil service working hours. Every time a ban was issued, it was also published in the government in-house magazine, Irish Ifigúil. Lawyers and possibly accountants subscribed to this, but most people didn't read it. It's still being published today. You probably don't read it now either. If you were looking to find the blacklist in your newspaper, you would be sadly disappointed. After the first few months in 1929, only the Irish Times reported on banned titles in detail. Every other local and national newspaper merely reported the totals. So there'd be one line that would say something like 45 books and 10 papers banned this month. No details on what those books were. Unless you read the Irish Times, then you couldn't be sure what was banned and when. The blacklist couldn't function as a guide to smut because hardly anyone knew what was blacklisted. The Irish Times came up with a great word for this regime, this pervasive, inscrutable system. It called it the censorship, so it made it into a proper noun. And I think that tries to convey how it was everywhere, but also strangely invisible. Sean O'Foyle, whose work was banned many times, offered a kind of a succinct description of how this system was policed. Now we just go back. So he named 7 censorships. The first one, at the apex of the triangle, is the board itself. Then we have booksellers, who obviously decide to keep books off shelves. We then have librarians, who do the same work in a public book sense. Library users and library committees help librarians to choose which books to ban by complaining about them. The library committees are also the book selection committees at this point, and they decide what to buy for the shelves. The public in general, but especially clergymen. And finally, his last censor is fear. And it's telling, I think, that Aoife nominated an emotion, a feeling, because it's fear that the censorship board stokes. Watching the board working hard, issuing thousands of prohibition orders, most people came to the quite justifiable conclusion that indecent material must be everywhere. They soon believed, some more than others, that a dirty book could injure a reader, and they became afraid. And after all, what will we not do to relieve our fears? It was lucky then that the censorship system didn't really demand that much of Irish people. They were expected to keep quiet and agree with it. Apart from a few noisy exceptions like, for example, Frank O'Connor, Lynn Doyle, and even Edna O'Brien, the population didn't protest. Even the change in the law in 1967, brought in by Brian Lenihan, was not a response to public outrage. So this is a slide distilling the changes to the Act that were brought in 1967. Permanent bans were abolished for books, so it was only 12 years. Permanent bans on newspapers or birth control information remained. And there was no change to the appeals process that had been established in the 40s. Only publishers and elected representatives could appeal. So at the time, any one of us in the room, because we're not elected, we couldn't write to the censorship board and ask it to change its mind about a banned book. And I think the law was liberalised at this time because strict censorship was getting kind of embarrassing. European observers were baffled by it, and as you know, Ireland is turning more towards considering a place in Europe and the EU, as it was then. In Britain, which is normally our greatest role model, soft porn is on open sale by the late 60s. And politicians like Charlie Haughey and Brian Lenihan, who are the young men of Fianna Fáil at the time, were not convinced that Ireland's uniqueness was that cultural isolation. Everyone in government was getting tired of defending censorship to the foreign journalists who used to ring them up and ask about it. Civil servants were really painfully embarrassed by the lists of banned authors that were subsequently published in those newspapers abroad. It was time censorship law matched their vision of Ireland as a more modern nation. Brian Lenihan didn't want to abolish censorship entirely, but he did believe it could be applied more selectively. So the law was amended in 1967 to limit prohibition orders in this way. Instantly, thousands of books that had been banned for 12 years or more became legal. Unfortunately, though, most of them were out of print, so it made no real difference to most readers. Even authors that were like wildly popular in the 1930s, they've fallen out of favour by 1967. Let me just talk about, Vicky Baum, who I'm a big fan of. She wrote international bestsellers in the late 1920s through to the 30s. And by the 70s, she's kind of old-fashioned. Her novels aren't considered great literary fiction, so they don't have the gravitas necessary to preserve them. So they fall out of print and they fall out of fashion. But I think this novel here, Helena Villefort, which was about single motherhood, marriage and work, would have been widely read in Ireland, as it was everywhere else, if we'd had the chance. It was translated into many languages. She wrote in German, but it's translated into French and English. This novel has some journalistic elements to it. The section where Helena tries to find a doctor who will perform an abortion has real undercover expose vibes. It's a social problem novel that blurs the line between fiction and reportage. Helena does give birth to her son in a mother and baby home and then leaves without him, but she is able to return to collect him once she has accommodation and a job sorted. She subsequently goes on to rear him herself. An Irish reader might have noticed just how Germany differed from Ireland in this respect. Now, I'm not arguing that a reader of the time would read this book about single motherhood in Germany, think about why it's different to the Irish situation, and then demand political change. And the reason I'm not making that argument is because that's the sort of argument the censors themselves made. It's the same mentality that thinks a girl reading an immoral advertisement will be irreparably corrupted. The relationship between a reader and a text, it's just not that simple. You don't read a book and then get directly inspired, necessarily. And these are the words of Ta-Nehisi Coates, and I think this really captures something about reading that's quite fundamental. He says, books work when no one is looking, and about that imagined world that only a reader can see. As he says, their power is so intimate, so insidious, that even its authors don't always comprehend it. You'll notice, he says, when no one is looking. It's the private world of reading that censors feared. The censorship attempted to create a culture where privacy was under siege, where private thoughts couldn't be trusted. And that's what's most disturbing about it. They were trying to eradicate spaces, those spaces where nobody was looking at you. I think Coates is also aware that these spaces can be dangerous. He does describe a text's power as insidious, after all. There's something uncontrollable about it. Now, the legislation in '67 may have curbed the censor's power, but it could not undo all of those lost reading opportunities. There were thousands of censored books and hundreds of thousands of readers who never created those imagined worlds, who couldn't enter into mysterious conversations with texts. We can't know what Irish culture would have been like without the censorship, but I'm convinced it would have been different to what it was. And also, of course, 1967 isn't the end. J.P. Dunleavy's The Ginger Man was banned again as soon as its first prohibition order expired, banned instantly. And that is an old book. The blacklist didn't grow as fast after 1967, but fiction and non-fiction works continued to be added to it. The board and the censorship machinery, it works throughout the 1980s. So in 1980, the board met 10 times. And you can see that they examined 139 books. They banned 74. They examined 29 periodicals, and they banned 23. If a publication ended up then before the censors, it had a pretty good chance of being banned, especially if it's a periodical. That's an incredible success rate from the censors almost. This is a board that's really in the habit of banning. The vast majority of these publications, the ones that they looked at, they came from revenue, more specifically the customs section. 128 of those 139 books were referred by revenue. Just 11 came from the members of the public. Just 11 people bothered to complain on their own. It's the government machinery that drives censorship, and specifically customs, the men examining the books and the newspapers at the border as they enter the state. So I'd like to characterize the decades after the '67 Act, the 70s, 80s, and 90s, as ongoing surveillance. Best illustrated, I think, by what lives behind this door in the Department of Justice. It's not Bosco's magic door, it's much less colourful, but inside was amazing. So in this room lives the Censors Library, a collection of books and magazines created by the Office of the Censorship Board. I came across it by accident. In other words, the sort of accident where someone told me they found it first. Because there are no real accidents. I actually was pretty sure that this didn't exist, this collection didn't exist. And the reason I was sure is that lots of people have viewed those bound volumes I showed you, the blacklist, the 7 volumes of the Register of Prohibited Publications, but I had never heard of a censorship library. There have been books written about censorship. I have read them carefully. So, and the one that's most important is one written by Michael Adams, and he wrote it in the 1960s. It's a kind of candid, behind-the-scenes history. And in it, he said that the books, after the Censorship Board was finished with them, were returned to their owners. They were sent back to customs, wrapped up, posted back to whoever owned them. In Britain, obviously, not in Ireland. If you were waiting for your book, it wasn't coming to you. So when he wrote that sentence, this library already existed because the dates of some of the books within it predate his book. It's already tangible, it's on shelves, but it's a secret so profound that no one's going to tell anyone about it. He had looked for it and he'd asked specifically if it existed. It's interesting because members of the censorship otherwise trusted Adams. They spoke to him. The footnotes mention his conversations. He consulted private papers in people's homes. It's quite clear he had a good relationship with the people involved in censorship. He traced the machinery of bureaucracy in detail, how the seized books travelled from the quaysides and post offices through various sections of the government and finally to the censors. He even gave us the great, wonderful, delicious insight that the customs officers sometimes brought confiscated publications home to ask their wives' opinions. What a dinner table conversation they must have been having. But no one wanted to tell him about this censors library. This is what it looks like today. It has actually been catalogued with the Dewey Decimal System. But it's, kind of a rudimentary catalogue. So after this door was unlocked by my kind guide, I discovered actually it's less a room and more of a cubby hole underneath the ventilation shafts. And this collection squats in suspended animation in here. The blacklist, in all its insane ambition, actually isn't in this room. The room would just be way too small to fit a complete collection of the censors' work. According to the catalogue, there's 4,000 individual books here, just over 2,000 individual authors, which is just a small portion of the 12,000 publication prohibitions ordered. I'll admit I was a little bit shocked and dazed by this library. I walked around taking videos of its shelves. I was pulling out books I recognized, but I was pretty overwhelmed. I mean, it's a lot to meet 4,000 books unexpectedly. I didn't understand what it was for or how it came to be. And as usual, when you think about censorship, if you start thinking about Edna O'Brien, it usually ends up giving you the answers. These are Edna O'Brien's books on the shelves, down at the bottom, by the way. It took me ages to find them. There are 4 of her banned novels here. 5 copies of Girls in Their Married Bliss, which is my favorite of her books. I just think it's absolutely hilarious. She's underrated as a funny writer, as well as being sharp and clever, just so funny. There's 5 copies of August is a Wicked Month, and there's 5 copies of The Girl with the Green Eyes, and one, of course, of the most famous one that you all know, The Country Girls. Just one of her banned 1960s novels is missing. And when I was looking closely at this corner of the bookshelf, pondering Edna's words on the censorship, how she gave out about them, I saw that these novels are well worn, the spines are cracked and creased, and the covers are tatty and torn. O'Brien's novels aren't the only ones showing wear. Many of the paperbacks on these shelves have been well read. So this is a secret library, a private collection of so-called smut, kept for the enjoyment of a select few. Members of the censorship boards, they're not paid for their work. This isn't a glamorous semi-state position at all. They don't get a salary, but perhaps this library was the perk of the job. And maybe that's why they just don't want to admit that it exists when Michael Adams asks. They don't want to admit that they're all reading the dirty banned books. Now, while these books by O'Brien were actually banned, there were many, many books on the shelves that I couldn't find in the Register of Prohibited Publications. Now, it's not an exact science, the Register of Prohibited Publications, because it's not an Excel sheet or a database, so it's not always easy to be definitive. However, I'm fairly sure that this wasn't banned. This is there on the shelf. Don't know why. The X-Files. Someone, somewhere, maybe a customs official, confiscated it and forwarded it to the censor's office. Now, it's kind of funny because we're all watching the TV show at the time, but we're going to ban the book. I don't understand. So this library, it's not everything they banned, but it does include things that they considered that weren't banned, in this case, this book. It represents an insight into the cumulative effect of thousands of decisions. The customs officers opening the parcels, outraged library members forwarding books, sometimes library copies. They borrowed a book, sent it off, got it back, and then the librarian had to pulp it after it was banned. There are also anonymous letter writers. There's votes at board meetings. This library is an artifact of bureaucracy, being both slightly ridiculous at the same time as being horribly sinister. You can't stop laughing at this collection. I mean, Exhibit A, the X-Files. But that doesn't make the intentions behind it any less terrifying. Now, apart from books, there were boxes of magazines piled in the space between the shelves. It's a very higgledy-piggledy room. And so obviously I went through a couple of the boxes because you have to. And this was one in particular in 52 weekly parts. I love it. It's kind of like sex position of the month or the week. And it reminds me actually of the magazines I used to buy as a kid. You know, you'd buy the first one and it was usually build a boat or build an aeroplane, and you'd buy it for 52 weeks, and at the end you'd have your completed model of, I don't know, Marie Celeste or something. And they came with a special binder as well. I don't know if this came with special binders. History does not record. So it's kind of funny to know that sex guides are sold this way. This particular magazine, I couldn't find a date on the cover, but like from the outfits and the hair, we'll say 80s, 90s. Now, you might be thinking, well, it's not surprising they're trying to ban a sex guide. But it's the 1980s. Like, at what point are we stopping banning sex education? But most of the boxes are not full of this sort of magazine. Most of them are mass market magazines that you all remember. And if you were a woman or a girl at the time, you bought them. This is 19 magazine. From the graphics, I think this is a 1980s cover. And if you look closely on the white swimsuit, if you can read the handwritten writing, it says, "For abortion ads." Without a hint of irony, they wrote abortion across a woman's stomach. These ads were for services in the UK, of course, where abortion was legal. The abortion ban was entered into the Irish Constitution in 1983, after this was published. So abortion as a service is illegal and unconstitutional. But the censorship laws also make it illegal to know that abortion exists anywhere else. We all know about the ban on the procedure, but I think we have forgotten why it was so hard for Irish people to get information about British abortion providers. It's because the Censorship Office is actively monitoring magazines and banning them if they find reason to. This edition doesn't come from customs. How I know that is because it has a sticker for Eason's on it, which means that someone pootled down to Eason's in the morning, bought the magazine, and then they sat with it to work out whether it should be banned. And this practice continued into the 90s if the evidence of these boxes are anything to go by. I absolutely remember Just 17. I'm sure loads of you do. So it's true that by the 90s, they're not banning the equivalent of Edna O'Brien. They're not banning proper novels, serious fiction. But they're continuing to watch closely over reading material that's aimed at women and girls. Just 17 was never actually banned, but that's presumably because they just couldn't find a reason. If it's in the box, they've been looking at it with an eye to banning it. During the 90s, the censors also did ban pornographic magazines aimed at gay men. That seems to have been their main concern, magazine-wise. And they also had a frankly weird habit of banning vintage erotica, 19th-century porn that was reprinted in the 80s and 90s. I don't know what was fashionable about 19th-century porn in the 80s or 90s. No one's written about it yet. So they're still working away. It's all in the background, and nobody really pays much attention to them. And I'd like to conclude with this quote, again from Ta-Nehisi Coates. He says, novels, memoirs, paintings, sculptures, statues, monuments, films, mini-series, advertisements, and journalism all order our reality. In our gut, I think we know we are what we read and what we watch. I believe this to be true, actually. And of course, the censors also believe it. They restrict books or texts because they understand that reading is powerful. What we read can set the boundaries of what we imagine is possible and what we imagine isn't. But censorship is a problem because it's a simplistic and reductive vision of reading. When I open a book, I just don't know what awaits me, and I cannot predict if or how that story will stay with me. I also cannot tell if a book I found meaningfully will affect anyone else in this room in the same way. If I suggest you read a book and you think it's absolutely crap, you probably think the worst of me. Reading is just so unpredictable. That's both its joy and its greatest power. When censors restrict what can be read, they intervene in profound ways in a culture. For decades, the Irish Censorship of Publications Board helped to order a reality in which women had little or no right to information about reproduction. The only normal sexuality was heterosexuality. Single motherhood was extremely difficult to imagine for a long time. Divorce was a moral failing. Underpinning all of those constitutional referenda that you remember from the 80s and the 90s was censorship. It's a system that was working hard to keep dangerous ideas out of Irish minds. I mean, it shouldn't be a problem that British people are getting divorced, but we couldn't even know that British people were getting divorced. I would argue that the power of censors went beyond control of sexuality. The censors were reading everything over our shoulders from 1929 through to the 90s. The state wanted to control what we were reading and how we did it. The state also, most importantly, wanted us to keep quiet about this intervention, to accept its role in ordering our reality. And for the most part, we did. The censorship system ended up coming to an end only when the internet made it impossible to police the flow of information into Ireland. That's why censorship through the publications system starts to wind down from the mid to the late 90s. It's no coincidence that the internet is slowly percolating into Ireland. And of course now, we've kind of flipped the other way. The greatest site of censorship is now online. The recording of this talk, for example, YouTube will use algorithms to scan what I've said, to generate a transcript, and it may indeed censor it because I have used certain keywords. I should have, if I was being sensible, I should have said corn instead of porn. I should have said segs instead of sex. But I just feel like the irony would kill me, but also it's just too much like the censorship that we spent so long under. And hopefully we won't get into too much trouble for saying pornography in public. Thank you.